Okay, well, welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Barbara Buchner. I'm the Global Managing Director of CPI, and it's a true pleasure to moderate today's event and introduce you to the framework for sustainable finance integrity. This work is the effort of many months that my organization, the CPI, has been conducting under the valuable guidance of a very high-level advisory council representing the entire financial ecosystem, and most of them are here with us today, so thanks so much. The project was also supported by the Oxford Sustainable Finance Program at the University of Oxford. Over the last weeks, we've been working hard to ensure that our effort is a contribution to the fast evolving space. And while we've initially invited all of you to join the launch of what we call principles, we realized that this generated confusion on the content and purpose of our document. So we're excited to introduce you today to the framework for sustainable finance integrity, which more accurately captures both the scope of work and its intent. Yeah, in fact, given that flurry of new announcements over the last weeks, we have recognized that the world does not need another sign-on initiative that itself lacks a mechanism for accountability, and we're such positioning this work therefore to add what we believe will be the most value to the space, and we trust that our collective work will create much higher impact within this space. But just a quick overview of today's agenda. The co-chairs of our advisory council, who I will introduce shortly, will set the scene with some opening remarks. We will then have a short presentation to introduce you to the framework, followed by a roundtable of interventions by advisory council members. Two of our advisory council members will provide closing reflection before I hand back to our co-chairs for the final remarks. So today is the soft launch of the framework as a consultation draft. So we welcome your reflections, both today and in the coming months. For today, if you would like to submit a question to any of the speakers, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer all the questions, but if you're unable to get to yours today, please reach out to us at the following email address, adminlondon@cpiglobal.org, adminlondon@cpiglobal.org. And this session is being recorded and it will be available on the CPI website in the coming days. And with that, let's get started. And it's my true pleasure to introduce the co-chairs of our advisory council, who probably don't need any introduction. Laurence Toubiana, CEO of the European Climate Foundation, and Rachel Kite, Dean of the Fletcher School. So Laurence, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara, and really very glad to be here. And thank you in particular for you and your team to have engaged in this very, in a way, time-consuming and work and intelligence initiative to really think about problems that we, since the start of the COVID crisis, we saw coming. And the problems are, of course, in the context of this crisis, how to ensure and to push and in a way to argue to present the rationale for a green recovery. And that's exactly why finally this exercise was launched. And the second element was at that start of this process and this effort was how finally we can define something which seems to, what many body agrees with, which how we align with the Paris Agreement, which of course the question mark being how we make sure we align with Paris Agreement goals, and of course the Sustainable Development Goals. So you assemble a very interesting, very diverse, very clever, very just enjoyable advisory council, and many of whom you will hear from them later. But along with the quickly changing circumstances, both of the economy and sustainability action, and again, you see this wave of announcement and commitments. And in a way, that was this advisory council, in my view, is a guide to understand where do we go and how we assess what is happening. Just want to avoid confusion and then to make sure that we are really going in the right direction. And so we understood after a number of consultation and contribution that there was three things missing really in this enormous flourish of initiative, of ideas, of commitments, in particular when you look at now this sort of framing of the net zero by 2050 with everywhere, both from government, private actors, institutional investors, etc. First, that we need to be, there need to be something that how we really adding up something to a systemic change, which is always a question mark we can face confronted with all these initiatives. The anxiety, is this adding, is this really going into a systemic change, or finally just twisting a little bit the system, but with no tipping point in view? So I think first that there is needed to be a way to enhance the integrity and accountability of the many individual pledges and sectoral initiatives. I can tell, for me, it's an obsession now in preparation for the COP26. We need absolutely to enhance the integrity and accountability, because if we don't do that, again, we will face COP26 and again, this wave of announcement with a deep anxiety. Finally, is this credible? And if it's not credible, I can tell, because that was really embedded in Paris Agreement, if there is a question about the integrity, then all the system can fall apart. So that's why it's really important to have this first point. So second is we need, of course, to better coordinate across the silos. We have seen public and private financial announcement that of course commit to coherence, but we need to understand how these fit together, because again, when you talk about shifting the trillion and of course the role of public finance for it, we need the consistency element, how this will work, and how the coherence and impact on the net zero and sustainability, how the coordination can help deliver that, which is frankly for the moment not the case. The third one is to focus on sustainability and social justice beyond climate mitigation. And again, that's something which may be here and there, but not as a sort of permanent feature of all these commitments, for very good reason, because of course it's complicated and difficult, but it should be put first to address the many inequalities and vulnerabilities that, of course, the COVID-19 crisis has highlighted and increased as problems. So I'm very happy to see this draft framework released today, because it tried to respond with the first draft to these three necessities. Of course, this framework does not it all. That's why Barbara said clearly it's a contribution and we need feedback, because I do think these three questions has to be responded before COP26, in my view. So very, very interesting conversation. I'm really eager to listen to all. And again, thank you again, Barbara. Thank you to the team again. Thank you to the Advisory Council. I was always fascinated by your remarks, and I'm very happy to turn it over to my co-chair, Rachel.
Well, thank you very much, Laurence. It's always a pleasure to work with you, and this has been a very interesting process. I'd like to extend my thanks as well to the members of the advisory group, not only for the amount of time and care that you've put into this work, but also the intellectual contribution. This is complicated systems change, and I think we've engaged in it in a very open way, which has been very important, and at a time when things are beginning to move really quite fast. Of course, the speed with which things are moving is very welcome. Here we are finally having very nuanced conversations around financial architecture, around how to optimize the commitments of the first movers, how to bring others along, and then how to ensure that the direction of travel is one that is consistent and which is a direction that everybody moves in. I think that the framing by Laurence of integrity, accountability, of coordination, and not losing the social and justice elements of the path to prosperity that comes from sustainability is exactly correct. And this is a careful balancing act as we see different competing pressures within a boardroom, within a C-suite, within a sector of the financial industry, perhaps looking more hesitantly or not at how fast to move in which direction. So with so many different moving parts, with so many different initiatives, I think this work is extremely timely. And as we have worked together, I've become more and more convinced that we do need, based on technical rigor, the technical rigor that I'm proud as a board member of CPI, that CPI brings to the table together with its partners at Oxford and ECF, that based on technical rigor, we should be able to put a framework into the discussion as a contribution for some guardrails around the race which we're running, and running at an increasingly fast pace. So we have many members of the Advisory Council with us today, which is fantastic. They are going to be able to give you their thoughts on this work and how useful it is to them in each of their very different walks of life. And it's been the process of bringing together those who are at different, wearing different hats within the financial sector. I think that's brought a real richness to the work. It is a contribution, it is a framework, so we are all ears on how you respond to this, both in terms of the substance, but also in terms of how it can actually help move the different initiatives and the sort of framework for thinking about how all of these initiatives add up. We're very open to your feedback and contributions. At the end of the day, as one community living on one planet, with one sort of set of scientifically determined goals in mind, it's very important that we don't kid ourselves that we are making the progress that we need to make, or that we are not making the progress we need to make. And we need to be able to talk to the general public, talk to investors, talk to each other honestly and openly about progress, about what's difficult, what's not difficult, and hold each other to account, as well as then operate within strengthened global accountability frameworks. So this is a modest contribution at a critical moment in a critical year, and I look forward to the conversation over the next few minutes. It's been a pleasure to be co-chair in this important process, and I look forward to the feedback that we get as a result of the soft launch today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, both Laurence and Rachel, for, as always, very inspiring opening remarks. Again, I think focusing on how can we enhance integrity, accountability, how can we enhance coordination across the silos, across public and private, and how can we enhance focus on sustainability and social justice. A careful balancing act, as Rachel said, but again, we certainly will do our contribution. But with this, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague Bella Donconogi, who is a Associate Director at CPI here in our US office, who will provide a presentation of the framework. Bella, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Barbara. Let me just check that you can see the slides.
Yes.
Great. So thank you again. I'm really pleased today to give an overview of the draft framework we developed and the analysis that went into it. So let me first start by giving you some background on the project. As you heard, the question we asked at the start was how to ensure alignment of finance with the SDGs and Paris Agreement during the recovery period, building on and bringing together the many existing efforts and the many different groups of financial actors. And we defined recovery period broadly to indicate that it goes beyond immediate relief. And then based on discussions with our advisory council, we defined the 3 objectives for the work, which Laurence mentioned and which are on this slide. With the support of the project team and co-chairs, we brought together this regionally, sectorally, and gender diverse high-level group of people who really did an incredible job, as you heard, challenging us to think big and make a real contribution to this space. So together with their guidance, we developed this theory of change for the work. First, we spent most of the fall establishing the narrative, which we've outlined in that objective statement. The last months have been spent on the second step, using that analysis to develop the framework that we're presenting today. And from here, the plan is to go to the third step to revise the framework and consider further implementation and analytical approaches to enhance coordination, share knowledge and support coalitions, track commitments and progress, and to make progress on collaboration needs, which I'll tell you more about. So we hope to launch the next phase of this work at or in advance of COP26. So let me tell you about the analysis and framework we developed over the last months. The consultation draft we released today, which you can find on CPI's website, has 3 core objectives. So first, to build a narrative that economic, environmental, and social recovery is the only path forward, and really the real risk lies in not achieving that. Secondly, to offer those setting and evaluating commitments a credible framework against which to assess, both to understand the minimum and leadership benchmarks. And thirdly, to identify issues that need more analysis and attention and would particularly benefit from cross-sectoral collaboration. So the way we got here is first by analyzing all of the existing commitments and statements that have been made by various coalitions. So those are in blue in this diagram. And then the progress that has been made in enabling the coalitions with technical and best practice work, and some of those initiatives are in orange. And then finally, also looking to understand the gaps that have been identified by academics and the advocacy community. We analyzed each of the coalition commitments to come up with defined categories of action that commitments fall into. Those are listed across the top of the table: targets and objectives, implementation, and metrics and transparency. We then use those categories to dive more deeply into what is similar across the financial system and where are there divergences. So across the actor groups, which you find in the leftmost column. I should say too, we've been scrambling to keep this analysis up to date, already adding in the Net Zero Banking Alliance as quickly as we could, among others. And certainly there are some new announcements that we've missed. So in terms of what we took away from the analysis, so first we defined minimum benchmarks. Those are really the most common commitments. They're general consensus actions across the financial system that have become a starting point. You can see those on the screen. Then we looked at, okay, what topics aren't always so well defined? Where has there been perhaps not enough or inconsistent or insufficient convergence? And where do we see pockets of ambition and could possibly call something leadership or best practices? So those are the topics listed here in the bottom left box. So, and then across all of these areas, we really, as Laurence and Rachel mentioned, really want to draw attention to, amongst all of these commitments and coalitions, there needs to be more attention for just transition and social issues, biodiversity and nature and adaptation, in addition to climate mitigation, given the interrelatedness of all of these areas. So we use this analysis then to define the leadership benchmarks with details and examples by actor group. We use it also to identify where collaboration and further thought leadership is needed. And the paper has the full elaboration of what benchmarks we came up with through this analysis and examples throughout. And as time is very short and we want to hear from all of the advisory council members who've joined, I won't go into those details, but they are available in the paper online. So during the analysis, we also came across a number of areas where more work is needed, and there are some initiatives, of course, already contributing or starting up. The next step can be more about collaboration to ensure that the actions of individual actors and coalitions sum up to more than their parts to reduce systemic risks and accelerate the sustainable transition. So from here, we have, of course, published the consultation draft of this work today. I just want to point out that alongside it, we've also released 3 investment blueprints as discussion drafts to hopefully provide some input into discussions on sustainable recovery investment opportunities. Then we're planning to collect feedback and hear from different actor coalitions and stakeholders on how to refine the work, how to support implementation, uptake, and best practice coordination. And we're also making plans for further evidence-based analysis on the collaboration needs, and most importantly, to try to answer the question, how does it all add up? And we'll be releasing an initial contribution to that question in a month or so called the Net Zero Finance Tracker, which is a parallel CPI initiative. Finally, we plan to revise the document and develop next steps for the effort in advance of COP26 and other key fall events. So thanks so much for your attention. Really look forward to your reviews and feedback. Let me now pass back to Barbara.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bella, and thank you so much to the whole team for all the work that went into this. And it's my real pleasure now to get us started on our little roundtable and really welcome interventions from our advisory council and members on why they think that this initiative is valuable and how it is useful in the space in which they're all working in. And so let me get started and welcome Paula Alvarez, who is the Assistant Secretary, Sustainable Finance and Special Projects from the Philippines Ministry of Finance. Paula, it's very nice to see you. And let me give the floor to you.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. And good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone. Actually, we want to first give our thanks to the Council for actually creating this framework. So we see value in it because, for example, the Philippines only accounts for 0.3% of global carbon emissions. Yet when we did our nationally determined contribution, our first submission, we had to employ a whole of government approach wherein we had to ask each sector of what is doable in terms of commitment. And when we came up with a 75% reduction from our 0.3% global carbon emission, from our point of view, it was already ambitious because most of our people, for example, those with highly vulnerable, like farmers, fisher folks, they don't really understand climate change yet. And we can't transition them right away. So it's a phasing mechanism. But then from your from your non-government organization's point of view or other people, this ambition might seem not to be too ambitious. So for them, we're not being ambitious enough. So I think the Sustainable Finance Integrity Framework is actually useful as a metrics in terms of measuring how developing countries' ambitions and what we have been doing is relatively ambitious in the context of our own economic development progress. So for example, if you compare, let's say, the UK or France, of course, they have already announced net zero timelines. But then for us, you can't really compare our economy with theirs and say that our ambition is less ambitious. Because again, our development needs is very far different from theirs. And that in our context, for example, how we see the integrity of commitments is really important. Let's say when we committed to the Coalition of Finance Ministers, we agreed to implement the Helsinki principles initiated by Finland. But then how much of these principles have we actually implemented? How do we measure our commitment in terms of these principles? In the same vein that when our central bank, our SEC, and all our other private banks try to commit to sustainability and mainstreaming of climate finance, how do we know that they're doing the minimum or they're actually reaching far ahead of what they can actually do? So this is where we think that the principles are actually, the framework is actually important. It is really to provide measurement, especially in terms of the COP coming this November in Glasgow, since we have developing countries pledge support, for example. What we want to see are actual financial instruments that are usable by financial sectors, not just funds that give grants. You know, although these are good intentions, we actually need measurable instruments that we can use. So I think this is where the framework comes into play. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. I think very, very helpful. And I think what you described also really describes a little bit the balancing act that also, like Rachel referred to before. And certainly the three blueprints that we are also kind of putting out for discussion today, I think hopefully will help us on the second point on really kind of the specific instruments, but certainly helping to measure ambition is what we hope we will contribute to. So, but with that, let me invite Patrick Dlamini, who is the CEO and Managing Director of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, to hear his views on this initiative. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you to your team, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to colleagues. And really, this is a massive milestone. I sincerely congratulate CPI for the leadership in this regard. And I think for the first time in the history of the world, we have something that we can all be able to refer to. This framework says it really makes our decision-making and our benchmarking much more easier for us as actors in the financial system. I mean, especially as a public development banks, we under the leadership of the International Development Finance Club, called for the summit of the public development banks to start looking at aligning between ourselves and also to start looking at common understanding. So these benchmarks are going to go a very long way, because we also intend as IDFC, together with the multilateral development banks, to further engage amongst ourselves to ensure and to see how can we best support each other, how can we best work with each other, and how can we best serve as accountability partners. Because this is about the future that we all want. It's about just transition for many of us. It's about how do we then start looking at that fine balance and also taking into account the importance of nature to the livelihoods of communities. Because as the United Nations report says, that those two have got to be looked at as one, because they are so interdependent. We know that in many economies, biodiversity and nature are such critical drivers of the livelihoods and economies of many. And here I'm talking about the sub-Saharan Africa. We have over 37 countries that are fragile economies. You can imagine, but how then do we make sure that the recovery is driven in such a way that we more than ever before take into account that the biodiversity has got to be mainstreamed by all of us in the financial system? And how do we also get to work together with civil society in our respective countries and globally to make sure that we work in a manner that will ensure that just transition becomes just that? Because it can never be just if it's not exclusive. It can never be just if it's not equitable. So we have a responsibility as a collective, as a total financial system, to start looking at how are we driving the development into the future that we all want in such a way that it talks to the needs of all communities and the need of nature, so that we become responsible. How are we looking at our portfolios in such a way that we make sure that it talks to this future that we're looking for? So these benchmarks are such a powerful tool, because I'm very, very positive that as we have already started, we are one of the accredited institutions by the Green Climate Fund, working together with them for a number of initiatives on the continent. But also, we are also starting to mainstream quite a number of activities that talks exactly to this. So for us, it's something that is really enriching us. It is something that is equipping our governance in our as the bank. It is also helping us to start driving very strong awareness on the side of shareholders, because sometimes our shareholder will make certain decisions not because they are well informed, but because they thought it was the right. But when we are able to engage with them at this level, it makes their decision much more easier, because they are signatories to the Paris agreements. They are signatories to the United Nations agreement. So really, this tool is a tool that really will go a long way. But we also want to be a serious opponent and ambassadors of both Paris Agreement and Sustainable Development Goals in our areas, also as part of the collective within the IDFC. I'm very, very, very positive that the recovery of our economy as we're driving it, it's really going to be much more comprehensive than it could have been before. Thank you very much, Barbara.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Patrick. I think sharing some very, very good points here. And again, I think we certainly hope that this will go much longer and that longer way than only this initiative today. But again, some really good points on how we can help, pushing some leadership, equipping institutions with input for governance, for driving awareness, shareholder level as well. So certainly some good input there. And thanks so much for really pointing out on the importance of just transition, biodiversity, nature. Certainly, I think is something we've all learned even more over the last year. But thanks so much. So with that, let me invite Joachim Levy, who is the Director of Economic Strategy and Market Relation at Banco Safra. And now coming with a long kind of CV, but Joachim, very nice to see you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's really exciting. This framework is definitely timely and extremely helpful, responding to different levels of ambition for different players, always centered on Paris alignment initiatives and also net zero goals, and covering these three fundamental dimensions, setting goals, the implementation and measurement. And I think that, like Patrick just said, it really is very helpful by connecting all the work that is being around. This is good for companies, this is good for government. It is worth, I think, adopting the higher level of ambitions that are presented in the framework. And I think in many countries, this implies promoting nature-based solutions, from natural regeneration of forests and landscape agriculture, which are the cheapest and most inclusive forms of a carbon sequestration, to supporting responsible biofuels, including in connection with electrical vehicles. This broadens the range of things that countries can do. I would say 1 minute about Brazil. Here, the financial sector, which has followed the principles of responsible investment for more than a decade, it has been stimulated by the central bank to really mainstream climate and ESG considerations in their portfolios and lending operations, and advancing also with the implementation of climate financial disclosure practice. It's all covered in this framework, and it's very helpful to bring all under one roof. And for commercial banks like Safra, you know that you have to gear up to respond to these challenges, and to have this really good guidance is very helpful. I think that indeed it provides this dialogue across different stakeholders, and help us to see the dimension for countries, economies to move from coal or oil-based activities towards net zero, which we know that is very essential to have, even to involve the population. Net zero is something that people can relate, especially if they're related to say new technologies, new solutions, and especially, as is highlighted in the framework, quality jobs, which are essential for this journey. Final comment, I think it's really worth all the interaction and the light you shed on the coalition finance ministers. This is extremely helpful because they provide this plumbing, both in terms of budgeting, in terms of regulatory action, carbon prices, that are essential to really moving away in the dimension that we all know is necessary for achieving our goals in the next 10 years. So count with the private sector to continue to support this really comprehensive and clear initiative. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joachim, and thank you also. I think certainly for us, the next phase now will be really making sure that we connect even more coalitions and really make sure, as you say, that the framework comes together with some of the plumbing and some of the specifics that hopefully will help push the whole space further, and really making sure that we continue also this dialogue across the stakeholders. So thanks so much for being here with us today. But with that, it's my true pleasure to now welcome Daniel Clear, who is the Chief of Staff, Global Banking and Markets, and the Global Head of Sustainable Finance, still at Hsbc. Daniel, it's great to have you here, and thanks so much for being with us and for being on the Advisory Council.
Well, thank you, Barbara. And first of all, congratulations to you and the team, I think, for today's publication. And I really enjoyed the group because it was so diverse. I mean, we have every part of the economy, we have every part of the globe in this group, and I think that really made this a distinctive piece, or I hope it makes it a distinctive piece. Over the last 12 months, we have seen more than 70 trillion of assets being signed up to net zero. The financial institutions, from the asset manager, asset owner, the banking segment, all pledging to align to net zero, which I think is a fantastic start. But to your comment earlier, now we don't need new pledges. Now we need actually to get on with it, and ideally accelerate the execution of this. And that's why I think these principles are so important, because if you look at what financial institutions struggle with, I would say there are three things. First of all, we all lack standards. Right? When we talk about transition, we all don't always mean the same thing. When we talk about the importance of nature, we don't always mean the same thing. And so I think it's really important that we have this framework of integrity of what actually is aligned with net zero, what isn't. What is a good transition, what isn't. The second thing that is missing is transparency. Right? I think there is an element of, we all make these commitments, but we now need to come out with much better disclosure, metrics that are aligned. There's a lot of work going on with TCFD and the like, but I think the framework today is a very good guide of what actually is necessary to create that transparency and show that we're actually delivering what we're doing. And that brings me to my third challenge, which I think is actually the biggest one. I think we have a lack of trust between different parties. And that's why I think people often revert to very simplistic ways of talking about transition to net zero, while in reality, we all know this is a super, super complex debate. And I think the group that you put together here and the framework that you published actually brings a lot of that trust, because we had everyone from governments, civil society, the private sector, actually speaking one language. And I think that is so important. When I look at Hsbc, we made our net zero commitment last October 2020. We are now founding member of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which was announced in April 2021. So we're now in the middle of how do we actually implement this? And we committed that we would set 2025, 2030 targets with clear pathways. And so for us, I think a framework like this one is so essential to have something that we can actually use as an internal and external guide to build that dialogue with all the different stakeholders that will have views on what the largest European bank does. And therefore, I just want to congratulate you, and I'm really looking forward to a continued dialogue with you and the team, because today is the start, hopefully, of a much bigger effort to, I think, as Ujana said at the beginning, we need to now have a very accelerated effort to bend the curve, which at the moment we all know isn't tending in the right direction. So thank you very much, Barbara. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you so much again. I think we certainly hope that this is what this framework can do, really help implement and help, think about like an internal and external guide to kind of becoming more concrete and making sure that we have the same language and have concrete metrics and measurements. So thanks so much. Looking forward to continuing this work with you. But with that, now it's my true pleasure to invite Sharon Burrow, who is the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. Sharon, it's been fantastic to have you as part of this advisory council, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. And indeed, thank you to all the panelists, because I think you've heard, and I would reinforce everything they've said, just how important this collaboration has been. For us as workers and representing working communities with a deep commitment to climate and indeed biodiversity, then transparency and integrity must be front and centre of all financial planning across all financial actors if we're to meet the challenge of a net zero future with the test of just transition measures, which is so vital if working people and their communities are to trust the transitions we need for every sector in that context to ensure a sustainable future that embeds social justice. We can't have a world that is simply a model of the world pre-COVID, or even before that, without recognising the historical levels of inequality, the unjust development models, and the failure to actually meet the test of sustainability across all those fronts. So this framework facilitates both development and assessment of integrity of investment decisions. You've seen great developments in the EU, the US, the UK as they lead up to COP that are putting people and jobs at the centre of sustainability. We need all investments, public and private, to help with these initiatives. It's not a time for PR
or empty commitments or siloism through competition. All investment has to have an ESG lens. There can no longer be a brown economy and a green economy, and you divide your portfolios accordingly. There has to be collaboration, essential to ensure sustainable, resilient, and just futures, with really tough measures for transparency of action across all of these areas. So I thank the Advisory Council, the staff, and Rachel and Laurent for their leadership. And I'm really looking forward to future collaborations. If we don't integrate the ambitions of people, planet, and prosperity, then we will not have the stable and sustainable future we all want.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I couldn't agree more with what you said. And I think, again, for us, this is the start today for really making sure we bring this to the next level and continue this work with all your guidance here. But with that now, it's my pleasure to invite Margaret Clough, who is the finance practice leader at WWF International, to share your views. And fantastic to see you, Margaret.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks for bringing together such an interdisciplinary discussion for the sort of complex systems change that we need, as was referred to in the opening. It's helpful to recall why this is so important. If the Earth warms by 2 degrees Celsius, we can expect more than 1/4 of the planet's population to be exposed to extreme heat waves every 20 years. We can expect 150 million more cases of malaria, which already carries one of the world's highest disease burdens, and we'll effectively see the death of coral reefs, home to about 1/4 of the ocean's biodiversity, and food for hundreds of millions of people, including some of the poorest in the world. At our current trajectory, we're more likely to see something like 3 degrees of warming. Biodiversity loss is likewise at critical levels, with estimates of about 1 million species at risk of extinction. And climate change and nature loss are highly interconnected in a feedback loop. So the more the climate warms, the less we can count on nature to help cool the climate or help us withstand the impacts of climate change. And the less healthy nature we have, the more the climate warms. So this COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the critical importance of protecting nature for human health and for our economies. And it's also helped us understand that we need to ensure the way we recover from the crisis builds in this sort of economic, social, as well as environmental resilience that will support us through the next crisis. The finance sector has an opportunity to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. The initiatives, the alliances, the tools and methodologies to enable that are many and growing. There's been exciting movement in the leadership space, from Science-Based Targets Initiative to the Race to Zero. And we see political leaders also starting to commit to more ambitious action in their nationally determined contributions. In finance, just a couple of weeks ago, we saw the launch of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, building on the experience and the leadership of the investors who came together almost 2 years ago to form the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which the UN Secretary General has recently referred to as the gold standard. We're also starting to see the Regulators Act, which is a critical piece of the whole sector transformation referred to in the opening. The central banks of now all the major economies are members of the Network for Greening the Financial System. And there's now also a working group in the NGFS looking at the linkages between climate change and nature loss and financial risk. So we spend a lot of time defining the leadership space, making sure that green is really green, sustainable is really sustainable, and that integrity is critical. But in order to get the whole economy transition we need at the pace we need, the whole sector has to move. And this framework starts to get a more fulsome conversation about bringing along the rest. Transitioning the full financial sector towards sustainability is an urgent priority, and it won't be achieved without this coordination and ambitious leadership for the coordination. This framework has the potential to raise the bar across the whole sector. This is so important for our economies, for the environment, for our societies. And I want to thank again, Laurence and Rachel and you, Barbara, for bringing us all together for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And I think certainly fully echo your plea, like on the ambition. I think we really need to think of how can we bring the full financial sector and really make sure that we coordinate and collaborate across across silos and groups. So thanks so much for all your help and your guidance here. But with that, it's my real pleasure now to invite Kate Hugh, is the Director of International Climate Change, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy at the UK. Kate, obviously, we've heard a lot already about the importance of COP26, so it's fantastic to have you here, and thanks for being part of the Advisory Council. So the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Barbara, and thank you, everyone. And I really agree with so many of the comments that have already been made. And for me, this is such a timely moment for this framework, with the G7 leaders meeting on the horizon, COP26 now less than 6 months away. And just today as well, Lord Stern published an independent report, which was commissioned by our Prime Minister, on G7 leadership for sustainable, resilient and inclusive economic recovery and growth. And this framework, this work here fits right in the middle of all of this, because improving flows of high quality, high integrity finance into sustainable outcomes and a green, just and resilient recovery is right at the heart of the UK's objectives for this year. And of course, finance is a priority for COP26 in November, both as a core outcome in its own right and as a crucial factor in the long-term success of the other COP26 outcomes and campaigns: energy, nature, zero emission vehicles, adaptation and resilience. Finance is absolutely critical to all of those. And we need to make sure that every financial decision takes these issues of climate and sustainability into account. So we're working hard with many others globally to build new public-private partnerships, those pipelines of investable projects and market structures to increase sustainable private financial flows, particularly for developing countries and emerging markets. And momentum is building towards our objectives, and many people today have already pointed towards this, with 127 of the world's largest investors having already joined up to the Race to Zero and the launch of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And those bring together new and existing net zero finance initiatives into one sector-wide forum ahead of COP26. But of course, challenges remain, and we've all got to look to see whether we are delivering the basics and then stretching ourselves to do more, especially on those elements of credibility and integrity that Laurence and Rachel mentioned at the start. And it's only, I think, by working together, drawing on good practice, best practice, acting collectively, and all pulling in the same direction, that the goals of the Paris Agreement will be met. So I'm really grateful to Barbara and her team, to Rachel, to Laurence and the rest of the advisory group for this framework here today, and the really practical contribution that it aims to make towards these outcomes by making concrete action realistic and achievable. And I'm really looking forward to our continued collaboration with you all over the coming weeks, months through to COP26 and beyond. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kate. And certainly we very much look forward to continuing this again. I think we really want to make sure that we can build on all the efforts that are out there, and really making sure we bring it together and kind of help move towards more leadership going forward. So thanks so much for being here with us today. But with this, let me actually move on to our kind of final segment of two additional reflections from our advisory council. The first one, I'm very happy to invite now Luis Pereira da Silva, who is the Deputy General Manager of the Bank for International Settlements. And Luis, you have been, obviously very actively involved in the development of this framework. You've been particularly influential in ensuring that the framework connects and coordinates the full financial sector. I think this is certainly something that you have brought a lot in our conversation. So I'd love to hear from you just a little bit, how this holistic nature that we hope the framework brings can be an important contribution to reducing the systemic risk in the financial sector, and just like sharing your perspective a little bit on the framework. So the floor is yours, Luis.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you very much, colleagues. I'm in agreement with all that has been said. I would like to thank, of course, also Laurence, Raquel, and Bella. I see very much merit in the principles and the framework, as all of you, as having this capacity to translate the general directions of net zero, of the Paris Accord, into practical, detailed rules. I think we are in a situation where science, the best science, has given us a sort of, in philosophy, it would be the equivalent of a climate categorical imperative, a la Immanuel Kant. So we have this generic principle, which all of you, from a scientific perspective, believe, but now we need to go beyond this moral perspective into concrete practical steps, because I think we all realize that time is running out, and the wait and see attitude against climate change related risk is itself very, very risky. And that's why I see the merit in the principles to have precisely the capacity to provide the financial sector with benchmarking, with consistency checks, with ways in which our individual behavior at the firm level and even at the individual level would be efficient in terms of risk mitigation, in terms of transition, in terms of initiatives, in terms of practical steps towards building financial path compatible with 1.5. And this, of course, brings the issue that Laurence was mentioning of integrity and accountability, because if you abide by these generic principles, then you would be necessarily bringing accountability to your own institution, your own firm, vis-a-vis the path and the principles that are set up. Now, the second point is that I think it's very important to realize that the framework is capable of connecting and coordinating with the whole, or at least advocating a connection and coordinating within the whole financial sector, as Barbara, you were mentioning. And this has been, I think, mentioning by many of you. We are changing, after all, relative financial costs in our economies, mimicking what needs to be changed in terms of relatively real cost with carbon pricing. And we think that it is very helpful to have this done in a way that is sustainable, in a way that allows us to price physical and transition risk in a sustainable way. But if you want to do that, you need to encompass the whole financial sector as a whole. And that's why, in terms of risk approaches, in terms of guidelines, this is what I see the principles doing. And I see more the capacity, and you see the audience that we have, of coordination also the whole financial sector with other agents, with treasuries, with international institutions, with development banks, with insurance companies, with standard setters, and of course with the central banking community, as was mentioned by colleagues in the call, because of the role that they play in also setting guidance for the financial institutions they regulate. Finally, last but not least, third and last point, I think the principles are helping not only to flag the importance of a sustainable green recovery. I think this is indeed the topic that, if you look at what's happening in the US and in Europe as well, this is becoming central, it's becoming mainstream with the infrastructure plan in the US, but also the Green Deal in Europe. We are providing, and the principles are by themselves providing a path toward this, paying attention to the redistributional consequences of these policies, because I think we all realize that if such a recovery and such a transition is not perceived to be fair, the burden not to be equally shared among the various groups in society, the political economy of the transition will become rapidly not sustainable. And this is not good for the efficiency of the path that we are aiming at in terms of creating a more sustainable, a more just, less unequal society with a transition towards a lower carbon footprint. So all this, I think, is brought by the principles. These are things that we can abide by, that financial institutions can live with in terms of generic, but also in terms of detailed applications that I think we are aiming at. And I thank you very much for the participation in this group. And I hope that this will continue to be among our priorities. Thank you, Barbara.
Okay, thank you so much, and Louis, really appreciate your reflections here, and certainly we'll make sure that we continue to build on that and to really particular focus on this coordination with the whole financial sector and other agents. And with that, I'm very pleased now to ask Marina Zeiss, who is the head of sustainability at Allianz's financial institution, and to hear your perspective really more as an asset owner and a private sector entity, just to understand a little bit from your side, how does the ideas, the framework align with the mandate that you have to drive profits into the future as well, but also, how are the sustainable development, just transition goals that you've heard a lot, just consistent with some of the risk-adjusted returns that you were focusing on, and how the framework really helps a little bit to speak to the goals that you have. So Marina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And yes, as an asset owner, Allianz is a long-term oriented institutional insurance investor. And for our customers, it is important that we invest their assets in a way that is resilient over decades to come. And this is why our goal is to achieve strong long-term returns with a balanced long-term risks. And of course, ecological and social aspects are critical to reduce those risks and seize the opportunities that transition provides. To take as an example, one element of sustainable finance, which is financing transition to a net zero economy, we do know that it is estimated that transition will cost around $1 to $2 trillion of US dollars per year. And this is, of course, a huge opportunity space for us as an asset owner with the global investment reach. And we are prepared to provide large amounts of capital to finance the transition, which will also help our long-term returns. At the same time, ignoring the long-term risks of global warming and continuing at current path of about 3 degrees Celsius, or to rely on the deployment of carbon capture and storage technologies at the unprecedented scale under certain scenarios for only 4 decades away from today, in our opinion, would be negligible under fiduciary duty. It is, of course, critical, what many speakers mentioned already, that all players in the system who want to lead the transition to net zero are united under the same goals in terms of the climate outcome. And that is to drive transition and the speed needed to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century with high likelihood. And based on the best available science that we know today, this means technically, for example, that all players need to tailor their work to drive real-world decarbonization along no or low overshoot pathways that the framework does mention, or to set intermediate targets in 5-year steps to track on progress, among, of course, other elements. And the leading financial institutions, standard setters, investee companies, and policymakers need to follow the same work principles to get us to the target that we all aim to. This is why we do welcome the framework and its emphasis on system-wide action and the rigor, accountability, and transparency of the leadership benchmark that it transparently outlines. And we do thank very much the team that put so much work to bring this framework to life at such a critical time today. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Marina. Thank you so much for all the guidance and really making sure that we build on what's been done in specific coalitions and initiatives, but then really kind of make sure how can we build on it and go beyond and really bring this focus on system-wide action and outcomes. But with that, I do realize we're almost at time. I will hand back to our co-chairs for any final reflections. I think from my side, I just want to use this opportunity really to thank everyone so much for all the guidance, for all the work. It is a balancing act, but I think this is, we are at the time where urgency is really important. And I think we certainly, this work want to contribute to the action in the space and want to make sure that we help focus on a whole sector transformation. But Rachel, let me hand back to you and the Laurence for any final reflection from your side.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara. And just a few words from me before I hand to Laurence for the final word. You know, I think we're at a point, at a critical point in this critical year. We are just weeks away from a G7, and then a few more weeks away from a critical meeting on finance and climate finance at the G20 in Venice. We're at a point where the political leaders are now needing to think through, with growing pressure from the financial sector itself, but also from wider society, about what government leadership looks like at this point in time, at this point in the recovery, at this point in the virus, at this point in the need for urgent climate action. And with all of that, the why, and that the why I think is fairly well answered. The what is increasingly well answered. It's the how that is still up for debate. And early this morning, I read the report by Lord Stern to the G7, commissioned by the UK as chairs of the presidency of the G7 this year. And I think when I think about that report and I think about the extraordinary work that this advisory committee has led over the last few weeks, then I think there is an extraordinary responsibility on all of us who are involved in this area of work to be able to delineate the how, and to make clear that that we hold ourselves to account, that the pledges can lead to choices, can lead to action, can lead to results, can lead to impact that can be measured, which pushes us on the right path and at a quick speed down that path. I think this is an important work. I think the conversation that we've stimulated has been important, but I think the work stands on its own and now needs to be populated, and now we need to have the conversation about how do we run fast together. And I look forward to that over the next few weeks and months. And I certainly hope that by the time we arrive in Glasgow, we have greater clarity about some of the questions that Daniel and others who are involved in the actual deployment of finance highlighted, as well as those on the government side who need to know that they can know that all of this adds up at the end and actually makes a difference. Thank you very much.
Just very few words to conclude, and just to indicate how, and you have certainly, for the one who have followed this discussion, how consistent, even coming from very, very different point of view and in a way just practice, how consistent the reflection is. And that in a way signals something very strong. Again, building on what Rachel said on this is a moment of the how, again, because we have in front of us a multitude of what we want to do, at least what targets we want to go for. And as, again, different members of the advisory council said, still it is complex to do the how. And that's why standards are trying to really improve them, clarify them, is a central piece of it. And I like that during the conversation, during the discussion, very interesting and vivid of this advisory council, just in a way came in the idea that we need to understand the different action of part of the financial system to others. And we need to put some order, some construction on that, because if not, it's impossible even to read what is happening. And it's important because the market will never provide that information. So we have to have a sort of an element of constructing from both of the bottom up, of course, this initiative, but now from the top down, what could be something where the language is corresponding for what kind of translation can be in a way used from one sector to another one to the same goals. And this language, this corresponding language, is really what it is about. and again, insisting on the transparency and the trust building, which I think is totally crucial before Glasgow. So really, as Rachel said and Barbara, inviting all of you to contribute to how we build these standards. And again, it's a complex and it's a moving target because we are making progress. Maybe 5 years ago, we didn't know how to do the race to zero or the net zero for investors. And it has all of you who has really built up progressively the pathway. So we need to see standards as a guide that has to be precise with all this community, but that can communicate to the other ones. So everybody has said that. And I think the home, the one roof element is a very important element. So again, it is a very, very solid starting point. The conversation should continue, but let's try to improve it in the 6 months we have, as Kate mentioned before COP26, and of course a different milestone before, that this begin to be we need to construct a common framework. We need to understand what does it mean for each sector, how we can improve the standards, and how we can improve the accountability. So this could be a guide for the goal, which is not still there because we need a lot of work together, but I think that could be a wonderful outcome for COP26 in my view.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Rachel and Laurence. Certainly, I think some clear guidance from you and the whole advisory council on what needs to happen next. Again, this is a start. This is a contribution to this space. You certainly remain committed to making sure that we can help and move ahead and really kind of increase ambition and enhance actually more of the technical details that are needed, that will, for us all to understand of how we're making progress. So with that, I thank you so much to all of you again for your time. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's been a true pleasure. We look forward to continue this conversation here and continuing the work, and we will be in touch soon. So thank you to everyone, and have a wonderful day and evening of wherever you are. Thanks so much. Thank you.